There is a question that locals in the riverflat country still argue about when the season turns cold and the talk drifts toward the years of the die-off. The question is not what killed the great flocks in that bitter third season. Everyone knows what killed them. The question is how a woman who bought 6,400 birds the hatchery had already written off as unsaleable managed to keep every last one of them through a calamity that erased nearly every other operation on the Delta. The answer is not a secret. She told anyone who asked. The problem was that almost no one thought to ask until after everything was already gone. Her name was Miriam Voss. She was 51 years old, recently widowed, and she had no prior experience running a commercial waterfowl operation. What she had was her late husband's 12 acres on the low side of the river flat, a cinder block barn with a corrugated roof, a notebook her grandfather had kept for 40 years when he raised mallards in the old country before the war, and a conviction stated plainly and only once to her neighbor when he came to inquire why she was doing what she was doing, that birds nobody wanted were still birds. That was the whole of her public argument. Birds nobody wanted were still birds. She said it flat, turned back toward the brooder troughs, and did not elaborate. The hatchery that sold her the 6,400 ducklings was Meridian Avian Supply, a regional operation that had grown considerably in the decade before, absorbing 3 smaller hatcheries and supplying the river flat delta with the bulk of its commercial stock. The manager there, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who wore clean shirts to work and carried a wireless headset at all times even when he was not on a call, had assessed the batch in question and determined it commercially non-viable. Runts, he called them. Wet hatchers, slow to regulate their own body temperature, undersized at emergence, the sort that big buyers rejected on sight because they disrupted the uniformity of a commercial grow-out. He had been prepared to cull the lot. Miriam Voss had called on a Tuesday and made him an offer so low he had laughed out loud before he said yes. Gerald Pruitt was not a cruel man. He drove out himself to see the unloading, which he later described to his account manager as a spectacle bordering on the tragic. 12 acres, 1 woman, a nephew named Casper who was 17, and spent most of his time reading paperback novels in the cab of the truck while Miriam did the work. 6,400 ducklings arriving in ventilated crates, carried into a cinderblock barn that smelled of pine shavings and the iron-rich water that came up from the low-bore well on the property. He told her, standing in the door of that barn with his clean shirt and his headset, that he admired her grit, but that she should understand the mortality projections for a runt batch raised without industrial climate infrastructure were not in her favor. He used the phrase mortality projections twice. She thanked him for the information. She asked him to close the door on his way out because the ducklings were still learning to thermoregulate. He closed the door. He drove back to Meridian. He filed the transaction as a disposal credit and did not think seriously about Miriam Voss again for 2 years and 4 months. What Gerald Pruitt had not read, because why would he, was the 40-year notebook that Miriam's grandfather had kept in a language half her family had forgotten. She had learned enough of it from her mother to read the entries slowly, 1 page at a time, tracing the handwriting with her finger. The old man had written about small birds, not with contempt, but with the particular attention of someone who had nothing to spare and therefore wasted nothing. He had observed over 4 decades of raising waterfowl in a wet climate with limited resources that the birds the commercial world discarded as runts were often not constitutionally weak at all. They were slow starters. Their thermoregulatory lag at emergence was a short-term liability and a long-term irrelevance. If you nursed them through the first 8 weeks with lower stocking density, warmer water access, and a higher fat feed ration than the commercial standard, they caught up, more than caught up. He had written in his cramped practical hand that by the end of the first season he could not tell his runt-raised birds from the premium stock he had once spent 3 times as much to acquire. He had written further, in an entry dated late in his 40th year of keeping the birds, that the runt-raised flocks had shown something the premium stock did not. He called it, in his own phrasing, a kind of seasoned stubbornness. They had come up harder. They were less brittle. Miriam did not announce this to anyone. She ordered the higher fat feed from a supplier 2 counties over who was puzzled by the ratio she specified. She sectioned the barn into lower density pens using materials that cost her more per square foot than the standard configuration. She ran the well pump longer each morning to keep the water troughs fresh, which added to her electricity bill in a way that Casper, who was tracking expenses in a spiral-bound ledger at her request, noted with visible unease. She told him to keep tracking and keep quiet. He did both. The word that traveled through the River Flat community in those first months was, at best, sympathetic. The Delta had a social architecture like any small agricultural territory. People talked, and the talking had a texture that Miriam understood without needing anyone to explain it. She was the widow who had bought the junk birds. She was grieving, clearly. She would lose the investment, clearly. The only question was how long it would take. Donna Pfeiffer, who ran the largest independent operation on the Delta and sat on the County Agricultural Advisory Board, stopped by in the second month with a casserole dish covered in foil and an expression that managed to be simultaneously kind and certain. She sat in Miriam's kitchen and explained, in terms that were meant to be reassuring, that even experienced operators found runt batches unmanageable, that the mortality in the first 6 weeks alone would likely eat through any margin Miriam had imagined, and that there were programs, county programs, that helped widowed landowners transition to less labor-intensive uses of their acreage. She left the casserole. Miriam ate it. She did not apply for any program. A man named Chester Rowe, who owned 200 acres on the high side of the river flat and was widely regarded as the most commercially successful poultry operator in the region, drove past the Voss property twice in the first month and then stopped the second time to lean on the fence and watch Miriam moving between the barn and the well pump. He did not get out of his truck. He rolled the window down and told her that he had done the numbers on a runt batch once, years ago, as a thought experiment, and the numbers did not work. She looked at him. She said she had done her own numbers. He said he had no doubt she had, in a tone that made clear he had every doubt she had. He rolled the window up and drove on. Chester Rowe's operation ran on a tight, integrated model with a processing contract, a feed supply agreement, and climate-controlled grow-out houses that were the envy of the region. He had borrowed heavily to build them. The interest rate on the construction debt was fixed for 3 years and then variable, and the variable rate had begun, by the time of his fence-side conversation with Miriam, to move in a direction his accounting preferred not to think about. But that was not the kind of thing Chester Rowe discussed at fences. There was a man from the Agricultural Extension Office, soft-spoken and young and earnest, named Philip, who came out in the 3rd month with a clipboard and a genuine desire to help. He walked through the barn. He counted the birds with an expression of surprised computation. He looked at Miriam's feed ratios and her pen density numbers and was quiet for a long moment, and then said carefully that her approach was unconventional and that the Extension Office's guidelines recommended higher stocking density for heat retention in large runt batches. Miriam pointed at the notebook on the table. She said her grandfather had kept those birds for 40 years. Philip looked at the notebook. He could not read the language. He wrote a careful note on his clipboard about non-standard practices and thanked her for her time and left with the look of a man who had done his professional duty and expected to be proven right about what he privately thought. The one person who did not leave was a woman named Ruth Delacroix. She had driven 40 miles to buy a small number of surplus ducklings for a backyard pond and had arrived on the Voss property on a Thursday morning in the 5th week of the grow-out to find Miriam alone in the barn, adjusting water trough heights for the 3rd time that day. Ruth had stood in the doorway for a long moment watching. Then she had asked, not with skepticism, but with the particular directness of someone who actually wants to know, what Miriam was doing with the trough heights. Miriam explained it. Ruth listened the way people listen when they already understand most of what they are hearing and are filling in the last gaps. She asked 2 more questions. Miriam answered them. Then Ruth said she had a van, and if Miriam needed feed runs on Tuesdays, she could add them to her own route at no charge. Miriam said she would appreciate that. Ruth drove the feed runs every Tuesday for the next 14 months. They did not discuss the arrangement beyond that first Thursday. They worked in the kind of silence that is its own form of contract. The notebook said something else that Miriam had thought about at length. Her grandfather had written, in an entry from his 23rd year of keeping the birds, that the ground under a healthy waterfowl operation was not passive. It was a record. You could read what the birds were doing by reading what the ground was doing. If the drainage was right, if the soil biology was right, the operation ran on something that was not quite a surplus, but was not quite a deficit either. It was a steady state, a word he used in his own language that Miriam translated roughly as the condition of a thing taking care of itself. She had spent the first 2 months not only setting up the pens but reworking the drainage in the 12 acres around the barn, cutting shallow channels by hand with Casper's reluctant assistance, connecting them to the low edge of the property where a natural seep collected and redistributed water at a rate the land had maintained without interruption for longer than anyone had kept records of. She was not doing this for visual reasons. She was doing it because the notebook said the ground that received clean waterfowl water and managed it well fed back into the flock's health in ways that were indirect but compounding. She had planted specific cover along the channel edges from seeds she had saved and ordered from a specialty grower, low grasses and sedges that filtered and stabilized. Chester Rowe, driving past on his way to a supplier meeting, saw her digging in the wet clay at the edge of the property and told his account manager that afternoon, with not unkind amusement, that the widow Voss had apparently decided to garden her duck farm. The account manager laughed. Chester added that you had to respect the effort, if not the logic. He said this sincerely. The birds grew, not on the commercial schedule, which projected a saleable market weight in 7 weeks for the premium stock. On the Voss schedule, which followed the notebook's gentler curve, the runt batch reached market weight in 11 weeks. Miriam had known they would. She had factored it into her original cost model, which Casper had entered into his ledger with the skeptical precision of a 17-year-old who had been told to track and not to argue. The feed cost per bird over 11 weeks was higher than the commercial standard. The mortality in the first 8 weeks was 3.2%, against a projected runt batch mortality of 18 to 22% that Gerald Pruitt had cited in his departure remarks. Casper noted the mortality figure in the ledger and underlined it twice, not at Miriam's instruction, simply because he had not expected it, and the number surprised him enough that he wanted to see it clearly. The summer of that first season was dry. This was not unusual. The river flat had dry summers and had managed them for as long as the operations there had existed. The aquifer held. Chester Rowe's climate-controlled grow-out houses ran their cooling systems at capacity. The electricity costs were significant but within the modeled range. Donna Pfeiffer's operation moved its processing schedule forward 2 weeks to avoid the worst heat. Gerald Pruitt sent a newsletter from Meridian Avian Supply, noting that summer conditions were optimal for the premium stock genetics the hatchery was currently offering, which had been bred for thermal efficiency, and that operators should be cautious about holding any legacy genetics through another hot summer. He did not mention Miriam Voss. She was not on his commercial mailing list. She had never purchased premium stock. She was, in the taxonomy of his business model, a disposal credit entry from 14 months ago. The second season moved normally. Miriam ran 2 grow-out cycles using birds she now hatched herself from the breeding stock she had held back from the original 6,400. The runt genetics, nursed through the first season on the notebook protocol, had produced breeding pairs that her grandfather's notes described as exactly what he had always aimed for. Compact, hardy, adaptive, and fundamentally indifferent to the kind of minor disruptions that rattled premium commercial stock. She sold processed birds to a regional market, a small hotel kitchen that had found her through Ruth, and to a specialty buyer who drove from the city and paid above commodity price because Miriam's birds dressed out with a particular depth of flavor that he told her, with the reverence of someone who dealt in subtle distinctions, was genuinely unusual. She thanked him and said she would have more in 10 weeks. He said he would be back. He was. It was in the second autumn of the operation, at a county meeting that Miriam attended because Ruth had asked her to, that she heard Chester Rowe describe his growth projections for the following year with the easy fluency of a man who had borrowed the future from a lender he trusted. He projected expansion to 312 acres. He projected a second processing contract. He used the word momentum 7 times in 12 minutes. Miriam sat in the back row. She did not raise her hand. She drove home and read her grandfather's notebook for an hour before she slept. The winter of the second year was the first real warning. Not dramatic. Not a catastrophe. Just a 2-week cold snap that came out of the north earlier than the forecast models suggested, and a concurrent outbreak of a respiratory pathogen that moved through the Delta's commercial waterfowl stock with a speed and thoroughness that caught the regional veterinary network by surprise. Chester Rowe lost 11% of his flock. Donna Pfeiffer lost 8% and had to suspend processing for 3 weeks due to a contamination protocol. Gerald Pruitt's newsletter for that winter quarter was notably shorter than usual and did not include projections. It included a note about the hatchery's commitment to supporting operators through challenging seasons. Miriam lost 2 birds in the cold snap. Both had been injured prior to the snap in an unrelated incident involving a gap in one of Casper's fence repairs. She noted this in her own ledger. She wrote the cause of loss clearly. She did not count them as pathogen losses because they were not pathogen losses, and she preferred her records to mean what they said. Philip from the extension office came back in the spring. He had a different clipboard but the same earnest expression. He walked through the operation, which was now visibly more orderly than it had been 18 months before, the drainage channels established and functional, the ground between the barn and the seep covered in the low sedge grasses that Miriam had planted, the breeding stock in a dedicated pen at the north end of the barn, the ledger open on the table with Casper's careful columns alongside Miriam's own annotations in the margin. Philip stood in front of the mortality figures for the winter snap and was quiet for a long moment. He asked if she had used a specific pathogen treatment protocol. She said no. He asked if she had vaccinated. She said yes, on the standard schedule. He said he did not understand why her mortality diverged so sharply from the regional average. She pointed at the notebook. He looked at the notebook again. She offered to translate the relevant passages for him. He said he would appreciate that very much. They sat at the table for 2 hours. Philip filled 4 pages of his clipboard notes. When he left, he shook her hand with both of his. He said he would be in touch. He was. The third summer arrived on a Thursday in what should have been late spring, which was the first thing wrong. The heat came fast and did not pulse but pressed, a sustained thermal event that the Regional Weather Service initially described as a temporary ridge and then, after 9 days, quietly reclassified as a significant anomaly. The river that gave the flat its name ran low. By the 3rd week of the event, it ran very low. By the 4th week, it ran at levels that the historical gauge records, which went back 80 years, had recorded exactly twice before. The aquifer that Chester Rowe's cooling systems depended on showed pressure drops that his management team described internally as concerning and externally as within normal seasonal variation, until the point at which this description became untenable, which arrived on a Wednesday morning in the 5th week when 2 of his 3 deep wells dropped below operational draw depth simultaneously. The commercial operations on the Delta had all, to varying degrees, depended on the same water system. The aquifer was a shared resource. The heavy draw of the climate-controlled houses in weeks 2 through 4 had accelerated the pressure drop in a way that no single operator could have predicted individually, but that the aggregate of their individual decisions had made nearly inevitable. This was the kind of thing that is obvious in retrospect and invisible in the moment of collective confidence. Chester Rowe's cooling systems failed on the Wednesday. His flock of 16,000 birds had no functional climate control in ambient temperatures that reached 39 degrees Celsius by mid-afternoon. The loss rate in the first 48 hours was catastrophic. Donna Pfeiffer's operation, which drew from a different but connected part of the same aquifer, lost well pressure 2 days later. Gerald Pruitt shut down Meridian Avian Supply's incubation facility for the duration of the event and issued a statement about force majeure conditions. which was a legal phrase he had asked his attorney to confirm the applicability of before he used it publicly. Miriam Voss had read her grandfather's entry about the great dry of his 28th year of keeping birds. The entry was brief but specific. He had written that in a sustained dry, the commercial operators lost their minds along with their water, and the way to not lose your mind was to not depend on what could not be depended on. He had written that the seep at the low edge of a managed property, if the drainage channels were correct and the soil biology was not poisoned, would continue to function when the deep wells did not, because it drew from a different stratum entirely, a shallow perched water table that recharged on a short cycle from rainfall and from the managed return of the water the birds used. He had written that nobody believed this until they needed to, and by then it was too late to build the channels. Miriam's channels had been in the ground for 2 full seasons. The seep at the low edge of her 12 acres ran slow in week 5 of the heat event, slower than usual, but it ran. The water troughs she had configured to gravity feed from the collection point at the seep stayed functional throughout the event at a reduced but viable rate. She had also, in the preparation weeks before the heat event arrived, moved her birds from the barn into a series of open-sided shade shelters she had built from poles and woven material over the course of the second winter, following a description in the notebook that she had initially assumed was specific to the old country climate, and then decided, on reflection, to trust. The shade shelters cost almost nothing to build and reduced the ambient temperature over the birds by enough that they did not require active cooling. They required water, and they required shade, and they required the specific low-stress stocking density that Miriam had maintained since the first week of the operation. They had all of these things. On the 9th day of the aquifer failure, Chester Rowe drove to the Voss property. He had aged, was Casper's private observation, made to Ruth later, in a way that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with what the previous 9 days had required him to know about himself. He stood at the fence. He did not lean. He held his hat in both hands, which was a posture Casper had never seen him use, and he looked at the 12 acres on the low side of the river flat, the shade shelters with the birds beneath them, the gravity-fed troughs running at their slow but continuous rate, the cover grasses along the drainage channels green in a way that nothing else on the delta was green that week. And he said nothing for a long time. Miriam came out of the barn. She looked at him. He said he owed her an apology that he was not sure he knew how to make correctly. She said he did not owe her anything. He said he thought he did. She said she had water, and she had birds, and she had room in the shade shelters if he needed to move some of his remaining flock, and she named a boarding cost that was, as Ruth later confirmed, substantially below anything that would have been considered commercially rational under the circumstances. He looked at her for a long moment. He said he would take all the space she had. She said she would have Casper open the east gate. She went back into the barn. In the week that followed, 9 separate operations on the Delta contacted Miriam about emergency boarding, water access, or both. She accommodated as many as the property could support. She charged the boarding cost she had named to Chester Rowe, which she applied uniformly and did not negotiate upward, despite what the market for functional water access on the Delta looked like that week, which was, according to a feed supplier who had driven through the region and spoken to multiple operators, unlike anything he had seen in 30 years of working the territory. Philip from the extension office arrived on the 4th day and asked if he could document what the drainage system was doing in real time. She said yes. He spent 3 days photographing and measuring. Donna Pfeiffer came on the 6th day, not to ask for space, which her operation was too large to have accommodated, but to ask how the channels worked. Miriam sat with her at the kitchen table and explained it from the beginning. Donna listened. Donna did not say anything for a long time at the end of the explanation. Then she said she had wasted 18 months assuming she understood more than Miriam did, and that she found it difficult to say that out loud, but she wanted to say it anyway because it was true. Miriam poured her more coffee. She said the information was not hard to replicate if Donna wanted to start in the fall. Donna said she wanted to start in the fall. Gerald Pruitt called on a Tuesday. Casper answered the phone. He came out to the barn to find Miriam and told her, with the careful neutrality he had learned was the appropriate register for conveying information he found personally significant, that Gerald Pruitt from Meridian Avian Supply was on the telephone and would like to discuss a commercial arrangement regarding the breeding stock she was now maintaining, as Meridian was reconsidering its supply genetics in light of recent regional events, and had heard from multiple operators that her birds had performed in a manner that merited serious discussion. Miriam wiped her hands on a cloth. She went inside. She picked up the telephone. She listened to Gerald Pruitt speak for 4 minutes, which was a shorter version of what he clearly could have said at greater length. He explained that Meridian would like to enter a contract arrangement to purchase breeding stock from her operation at a price he named, which was considerable, and that he recognized with a frankness he said he owed her, that the batch he had sold her as junk had turned out to be something else entirely. She said she knew what they were when she bought them. He said he believed that now. He asked if she would be willing to consider the arrangement. She said she would consider it and let him know by Friday. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen. She looked at her grandfather's notebook on the table. She said nothing to it because she was not the kind of person who talked to notebooks. But she stood there for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen before she went back to the barn, and whatever she was doing in that moment had the character, to anyone who might have seen it, of a conversation concluded. She signed an arrangement with Meridian that was structured not as a supply contract, but as a knowledge-sharing agreement. She would provide breeding stock at a fair price. She would also provide, in exchange for a fee that funded the operation's modest expansion, written documentation of the notebook's protocols adapted into plain working language, translated fully now with Philip's assistance. The documentation was specific and practical. It covered feed ratios, stocking density, drainage construction, seep identification, and the management of runt batch genetics, from first emergence through breeding age. It did not claim to be science in the way the Extension Office understood science. It claimed to be 40 years of a man watching birds and the 40 years of his granddaughter trusting what he had written. Philip submitted it with Miriam's permission and her co-authorship listed plainly to a regional agricultural journal. It was accepted. It was not widely read at first. Then it was. Casper was 21 when the documentation was published. He had been keeping the ledger for 4 years. He had, somewhere in the second year without announcing it, stopped reading paperback novels in the truck cab and started reading the notebook. His translation was not as fluent as Miriam's, but it was improving. He had begun to ask questions about the seep, about the drainage mathematics, about the relationship between stocking density and ground health that were good enough questions that Miriam had started answering them at length, instead of in the compressed declarative manner she used with everyone else. He had started in the 4th year, keeping his own supplementary notes in the back pages of the ledger. Observations, mostly. Things he had noticed about the birds and the ground that the original notebook did not cover because the old man had been working a different climate and a different substrate. Miriam read them. She said nothing about them directly. She did start leaving the ledger open to his pages on the table where she could see them in the morning when she made coffee. The 12 acres on the low side of the river flat looked, 5 years after the hatchery had laughed on a Tuesday and said yes to Miriam Voss's improbably low offer, like a property that had reached the condition her grandfather called the state of a thing taking care of itself. The cover grasses along the drainage channels had thickened into a permanent feature of the landscape. The seep ran with a reliability that 2 more dry summers had tested and not broken. The breeding stock in the North Pen were 4 generations removed from the 6,400 birds the hatchery had designated as junk, and the regional veterinary network, which now visited the property twice a year, had designated them, in formal language, as a population of exceptional resilience and adaptive fitness, which was the technical way of saying what Miriam's grandfather had written in his cramped practical hand in the 41st year before he died and left the notebook to the family. The small ones come up harder. That is the whole of the secret. The small ones come up harder. Philip mounted a laminated copy of that translated line on the wall of the Extension Office, with Miriam's permission and her name beneath it. It is still there. Casper drives past it sometimes on his way to the feed supplier. He does not need to read it. He knows what it says. He learned it the slow way, the only way it holds.